The Mitsubishi ASX is the compact crossover that you probably left off your shortlist. Does this improved version deserve your attention? It's certainly smartened up its act, a contender that's just that bit more capable than your average little urban SUV.
What is Mitsubishi's most important model? Well, to date, in modern times, it's been the Outlander PHEV. In future, it could well be this car, the ASX small SUV, here substantially revised. Now, this is still a version of the first generation model introduced way back in 2010, but it's been brought as up to date as Mitsubishi could make it, as we're going to see. This isn't ideal, of course. We should have had an all-new second generation ASX long before now. The reason we haven't is that Mitsubishi merged with the Renault-Nissan Alliance conglomerate in 2017, and its new masters want the fully fledged Mark II version of this car to sit on the same CMF-B platform as a Captur or a Duke, which is going to take rather a long time to sort out. So, to keep sales buoyant in the interim period, the original ASX was treated in the autumn of 2019 to an update that turned out to be just about as far-reaching as facelifts tend to get. Yes, another one. Now, in the unlikely event that you're familiar with the ASX model line, you might know that this design has already had one substantial facelift back in 2016. In the period from then until the time of this second update, the car lost rather more than it gained, the important options of four-wheel drive and auto transmission drifting out of the lineup, while the original visual midterm updates didn't keep the car looking current for as long as the Japanese brand stylists hoped they would, which was a problem given that the ASX has long been one of the most important models in the Mitsubishi range, the marque's third best seller, having accumulated 1.36 million global sales since its original launch, 343,000 of those in Europe, where this small SUV accounts for 27% of the company's total sales. All of which explains why we've got this car, tasked with keeping Mitsubishi's seat warm in the crossover category until the altogether more sophisticated Renault-Nissan engineered Mark II version of this model comes along. Lots has certainly been done. There's all new sheet metal from the windscreen forwards with a completely new front end. In addition, the automatic and four-wheel drive options return. There's an updated interior, and there's enough extra equipment to make rivals look stingy. Plus, the only engine option is now a more powerful new 2-litre petrol unit to replace the old 1.6-litre one, although it's still normally aspirated rather than turbocharged. In short, Mitsubishi is out to prove that there's still life in this compact crossover. Are they right? Well, let's find out. Let's look at the basic recipe here. A small crossover with a big 2-litre petrol engine lacking any sort of turbocharger, a power plant marshalled in most models by a manual gearbox with only 5 speeds, slightly vague steering, proper ground clearance, and the option of a decent four-wheel drive system if you want it. This is how SUVs used to be, and how they were when this current Mitsubishi ASX hit the market in its very first form back in 2010. The compact crossover segment, like the world it lives in, has moved on quite a bit since then, of course, but for reasons covered elsewhere in this film, the fundamental design of this car hasn't been able to progress with it, which will matter to you only if your perception is that a car like this should be a super mini with an SUV makeover. If that is the case, then the ASX probably isn't going to be your preferred pick in this class. Not when you're drawing up your shortlist, and not when you're test driving the thing either, assuming that drive comes after a trip in a popular class contender like the Volkswagen T-Cross, the Renault Captur or the Nissan Duke. To be fair though, contenders like those don't really represent this model's competition comfort zone. Despite its now trendier looks, this is a car that really prioritises sense over style. Suzuki's SX4 S-Cross is a similar kind of product. That car, like this one, aims to manage the rather uncomfortable task of somehow straddling the gap between small segment SUVs in the Duke and Captur class and mid-sized ones in the Qashqai and Kadjar segment just just above. Mitsubishi would also like to think that in its plusher forms, this crossover would attract the attention of customers of other compact crossovers that try to sit between the small and mid-sized sectors, like Honda's HR-V and Jeep's Renegade. We actually think that more natural competitors to an ASX would be no-nonsense, super affordable budget brand models from the mid-sized segment, so cars like SsangYong's Corando and the MG HS. Normally we'd save those sorts of comments for our market and model range section, but we're making them here so that you know what you're getting with this Mitsubishi. Now, as we've just said, if you want something Duke, Capture or T-Cross like in this segment, then this ASX will seem a little clunky and a little old-fashioned to drive. But against the more natural competitors that we've just mentioned, it'll feel far more closely matched. You might even think that it has a lot to offer. Now, if that's the case, then you want a bit more detail on the engineering and the drive dynamics that are on offer here. So let's get into that without any further ado. Now that the 1.8 litre diesel that used to be available in this car is no more, the 2 litre petrol engine that we mentioned earlier is the only one on offer, and it puts out 150 horsepower. That's quite a lot more than the 115 horsepower boasted by the 1.6 litre petrol that it replaces, and it's a figure that initially sounds quite promising in a class where the norm is an output of between 100 and 115 horsepower. The idea is clearly to compensate for this power plant's lack of the key ingredient that drives virtually all modern engines these days, a turbocharger. Now, Mazda is the only other brand in this segment offering engines without turbo boost, but that's by design rather than, as in this case, necessity. Mitsubishi would very much have liked to install into the engine bay of this car the 163 horsepower 1.5 litre petrol turbo engine from the only slightly larger Eclipse Cross SUV, but that more modern unit wasn't compatible with this older model. Does that matter? Well, that depends how you drive. The ASX copes quite well with leisurely laid-back progress, but should you have occasion to push on a bit, you might notice that the response from your right foot doesn't quite have the urgency that you might expect from an engine that's supposedly putting out 150 braked horses, and the official figures will back you up on that too. Rest to 62 in a manual ASX occupies 10.2 seconds on the way to 118 miles an hour. To give you some class perspective, that's only a fraction faster than you'll go in a Volkswagen T-Cross with a 1 litre engine half the size and a 95 PS power output over 50% less. Now you see just how much difference the turbocharger makes. As we mentioned in our background section, 2 important features make a comeback in this post-2019 model ASX, auto transmission and 4-wheel drive, and both come fitted to the variant that we're testing here. The Invex 3 auto gearbox is an old-style, rather laggy, belt-driven CVT affair, which rather exacerbates the engine's lack of mid-throttle pulling power. One writer likened this auto's get-up-and-go responses to those of a teenager on a Sunday morning, which is perhaps a touch unkind, but you do get the idea. Thrust your right foot on the throttle and there's a lag before an elastic band-like surge forward that rather impedes smooth progress until you adjust to it and learn to better use the rather lovely big Evo rally-style steering wheel mounted paddle shifters to more effectively activate the 6 virtual ratios provided. Once that's mastered, it somehow seems less important that sparkling performance isn't really on the agenda here, even if you use this transmission's provided sport mode. Rather curiously though, Mitsubishi suggests exactly the opposite, claiming that in the overtaking increment between 75 and 87 miles an hour, the auto version of this car accelerates almost twice as quickly as the manual model, 7.2 seconds rather than 13.7 seconds. Those are stats which, to be frank, we find a touch difficult to believe. And the 4-wheel drive system? Well, it's impressive that you get the chance to specify one. Small crossovers offering that option are, after all, these days very few and far between. In this case, the 4x4 setup in question is the same capable package that this car has had for the last decade, and it's based around a centre differential with electronic control, which determines the optimum torque split between front and rear, using sensor data on throttle position, vehicle speed, road conditions, conditions and driver inputs. It all works via 3 provided selectable drive settings. Now most of the time you'll be in 2-wheel drive mode, where torque is sent only to the front wheels for better fuel economy and agility. On a damp, icy morning, you might alternatively select 4-wheel drive auto mode, where torque is varied to maintain traction on loose surfaces or slippery tarmac. This can see virtually all the torque being directed to the front wheels, or up to 50% of it being directed rearwards, and that depends on surface conditions. Finally, if a snowy snap hits, you get bogged down in a muddy car park, or if you end up with your ASX somewhere that you probably shouldn't have ventured with it in the first place, then you'll need the 4-wheel drive lock mode. Now here, around 1.5 times the torque of 4-wheel drive auto mode is transferred to the rear wheels in order to improve traction. That'll be reassuring should you ever need to take this car on, say, a light field track, as will be the fact that the 190mm ride height figure is higher than you'd normally expect to find with a car of this class. It's actually 7mm higher than the bigger Eclipse Cross Model 2. We can't remember the last time a manufacturer in this segment even quoted a set of proper off-road stats to us, but we can give them to you here. An approach angle of 20.1 degrees, a departure angle of 31.4 degrees, and a ramp breakover angle of 19 degrees. Don't get us wrong, we're not suggesting that this ASX is any kind of off-roader. Road-ready tyres and the lack of a low-range gearbox will quickly bring your progress to a grinding, spinning halt on gnarlier surfaces. That said though, you should, if you have cause to venture off tarmac onto less testing terrain than that, we'd suggest that this Mitsubishi is probably a good bit more durable and capable than virtually anything else in the segment. We also think it'd be a better tow car than its rivals for something like a small caravan, say. The quoted brake towing capacity is 1.3 tons, which is slightly better than most equivalent competing models can offer. But few ASXs will have to work for their living in such a fashion, and even fewer will be seen on anything other than a paved surface ever. So if you were minded to consider this Mitsubishi, then you'll have to decide whether its tarmac drive dynamics would suit your preferences. Now, earlier we referenced the slight lack of steering feedback, but actually, if you can push on through that, there's quite a lot of traction on offer. Ride quality, that's better than you might expect too. Higher speed undulations are actually dealt with in quite an assured fashion, but inevitably the damping does get caught out by poorer tarmac tears and clunks over obstacles like speed humps. As for refinement, well, there's slightly more noise from the tyres and from the door mirrors than we'd normally expect for a car in this class, but the engine is reasonably muted unless, as is sometimes necessary given the slightly limited 195 Nm torque figure, you have cause to really thrash it, say as part of a hasty overtake. In an age where increasingly small SUVs ride and handle just like the compact hatches that they're based on, this ASX, as we've been saying throughout this section, seems cut from a different kind of cloth. But it does retain a rather refreshing old school appeal, which is artfully disguised by its most recent sartorial makeover. At least it's a bit different, and in such a crowded market segment, there's reason to be thankful for that. If we'd told you that this was a completely new ASX design, we reckon you'd have believed us. Now, what certainly is new is this car's fresh, more assertive visual attitude, especially here at the front. You can't help wondering just how much more successful this crossover could have been had Mitsubishi realised the need for this earlier in this model's production cycle. Most of the styling changes feature here at the front, where all the sheet metal forward of the windscreen is completely new. The bolder, more distinctive dynamic shield style front grille that we've seen on other recent Mitsubishi models like the Eclipse Cross and the 6th generation L200 has been adopted here. And in amongst all the extra chrome, there's a chunkier front skid plate and restyled squarer LED indicator and front fog lamp units nestling in this redesigned bumper. A lot less has changed in profile, although the ASX now has a bit more pavement presence thanks to its higher clamshell bonnet and squarer front wheel arches, which shroud the redesigned 18-inch alloys that feature with both trim levels. There's still the same upwardly slanting mid-level swage line just above the door handles, but this case now takes its starting point from what Mitsubishi calls a wing garnish just behind the front wheel arch. Other than that, the silhouette really hasn't changed very much, and that means that it remains really dimensionally rather uncomfortably close to the next model up in the brand's SUV lineup, the Eclipse Cross. It's just 40mm shorter. The rear too is fundamentally little different than before, although it looks a whole lot better thanks to a chunkier rear skid plate and smarter LED tail lamps featuring an elongated blade design. As at the front, the bumper's new too, with sharper lines and bolder detailing. So the ASX talks the talk from the outside, but has the age of this design been as artfully disguised on the inside? Let's find out. Facelift budgets rarely allow for any fundamental changes in cabin architecture, and this one's no exception. As before, the dashboard is simply and sensibly arranged, and it's fashioned from materials that feel built to last. But the designers here were clearly rather uncomfortably aware that buyers of fashion-led compact crossovers want a little more than that these days. So they've done their best to oblige within the necessarily narrow scope offered by this temporary redesign. Most of the updates are detail ones. There are new seat fabrics, or in the case of this top Exceed model, smarter leather upholstery. The air conditioning controls, they've been redesigned and they now feature piano black and silver accents. More piano black trimming now features on the central instrument panel, and there is a smarter black headliner. The auto gear shifter surround, that's no longer a huge ungainly circle, and perhaps most significantly, the centre dash infotainment screen, that's increased in size from 7 to 8 inches. This smartphone linked display system has certainly smartened up its act. It now includes Apple CarPlay and Android Auto smartphone mirroring, as well as the usual DAB audio and Bluetooth features. Plus, on this top Exceed variant, you can get something here that you can't have on Mitsubishi's supposedly more sophisticated Eclipse Cross SUV. Built-in sat-nav, and it's a decent TomTom system. The monitor is the usual touchscreen affair with the home display divided into multimedia, phone, settings, navigation, info and apps sections. The navigation is of a very basic type, and there's no kind of vehicle trip computer data. The info area hasn't actually got much info, but otherwise it all works well enough, with a notable lack of the kind of screen resolution delays which do afflict some other models we've tried recently. That's it for digital screens. Unlike some rivals who these days provide the option of a set of virtual dials in the instrument binnacle, the recess gauges here that you view through this redesigned 3-spoke leather-stitched steering wheel are very much of the conventional kind, and they're separated by a small display with fuel and temperature readouts, plus a consumption meter, and on this 4-wheel drive model, information on the drive setting chosen. As I mentioned previously, what we really like about this interior is the way that it feels so solidly constructed, which isn't the case with some of the fancier Super Mini derived cabins that you'll find in many of this car's competitors. Now true, the doors don't shut with a kind of thud that you would get on a rival Volkswagen Group product, and squidgy soft touch plastics are mostly lacking. Expect more of that in the forthcoming second generation version of this model. But in compensation, you get the feeling that in a decade or so, everything in here will still be reasonably well screwed together and functioning properly. It's traditionally SUV-like in that sense. Ergonomically, things are pretty sound too. There's a kind of reasonably commanding driving position that some cars in this class make you do without, and there's plenty of reach and rake adjustment for the steering wheel here, along with decent foot space around the pedals. Over the shoulder visibility, that could be better. The tapering rear roofline doesn't help there, but there's a rear parking camera supplied as standard across the range to compensate for that. Onto cabin storage, there's a deep, shallow cubby at the bottom of the centre stack, and that's clearly intended for your phone because twin USB ports lie just above it. But if that's the case, why hasn't Mitsubishi provided this area with a covering panel so you can charge your device out of the sight of prying eyes? An area that you can use to keep things out of view is this lidded storage box between the seats, which incorporates a lift-out tray and a 12-volt socket. What else? Well, there is a decently sized glove box, but that can't be cooled. There are ticket clips incorporated into the vanity mirrors on the sun visors, and you get twin cup holders down here by the conventional handbrake. There is no overhead sunglasses compartment, but the door pockets each incorporate bottle holders, although they are narrow. Right, let's take a look at the rear seat. As we've remarked elsewhere in this film, this ASX is one of the largest small segment crossovers you can buy. It's actually only 29mm shorter than a Nissan Qashqai from the next class up, which should translate into decent levels of rear passenger room for a car this size. Now, first impressions are good. The doors open widely and the apertures are broad enough to make it easy to lean in and, say, attach a child seat. Once inside, spatially, it's really not that much different from what you get in something like a Qashqai. That's helped by reasonable legroom and the relatively low transmission tunnel, so 3 adults could just about sit together back here, providing they were on pretty friendly terms. They didn't mind rubbing elbows and the journey wasn't too long. Headroom is pretty good too by class standards, although it is fractionally compromised by this top model's panoramic glass roof, which agreeably floods the cabin with light. Not everything's great though. We had hoped that these seat bases might slide and recline as they do on the Eclipse Cross. Seat sliding is de rigueur in the ASX's class with direct rivals like Renault's Captur and the VW T-Cross, but again, that's a casualty of the general age of this design. Perhaps the fact that this is one of the few cars on the market with no rear door pockets has something to do with that too. That's annoying because apart from these tiny recessed trays by the door pulls, there's almost nowhere to put anything. You only get a seat back pocket on the left hand side, which does seem rather mean, as does the provision of just a single coat hook. You do get a fold down armrest. That's a feature that's missing on some of the Super Mini derived SUVs, but although it does provide a couple of cup holders, there's no integrated storage. Right, let's take a look out back. Now, the light tailgate can't be power operated. That is a modern fad that we could quite happily do without. And once it's risen, there's a usefully low loading lip and a reasonably sized 442 litre boot. To give you some class perspective, that's 20 litres more than a Renault Captur, 22 litres more than a Nissan Juke, and 42 litres more than a Skoda Kamiq. Decently class competitive then. And that's just as well because there's nothing particularly user-friendly on offer here. There is space beneath the boot floor, although only because, rather disappointingly, on what is a reasonably capable small SUV, Mitsubishi declines to offer any sort of spare wheel, space saver or otherwise. There's no adjustable height boot floor either, nor can you specify a ski hatch, a 12-volt socket or a luggage net to keep small items from rolling around. You do get small recessed compartments in each front corner of the cargo area, and there are 4 tie-down points, plus on the right there's a boot light and on the left there's a luggage hook. The rear bench has a conventional 60-40 split and it folds to reveal a 1,193 litre capacity. There's no option for a fold-down front passenger seat, which would accommodate longer items like surfboards, but if you specify a tow bar, you can add an attachment to it that'll take a couple of bicycles. The ASX range is a pretty simple one to get your head around. Prices start at just over the £20,000 mark, and there are 2 trim levels, base dynamic or for £2,300 more, this top Exceed variant. Now these days with the ASX, only one engine is fitted across the range, and that's a 2 litre 150 HP petrol unit, and it's usually mated to front wheel drive and a manual gearbox. Choose this Exceed version though, and for that extra £2,300 £1,500, you'll be offered the option of a variant with CVT automatic transmission and four-wheel drive, which is what we've got here. Do bear in mind that for only a couple of thousand more, though, your Mitsubishi dealer could sell you the brand's more modern Eclipse Cross SUV, which is it's more efficient, it's slightly bigger, and it's based around more up-to-date engineering. Now, obviously, in the current market, rivals for this car are many and varied. The issue is, though, which rivals should you be looking at? Compact crossovers of this kind are either based on super minis, and that delivers models like the Nissan Juke, or they're instead modelled on slightly larger family hatchbacks, and that would give you a car like Nissan's Qashqai. Now, this ASX is closer in size to cars in the larger of those two categories. For example, it's a significant 155 millimeters longer than a Juke, but it's only 29 millimeters shorter than a Qashqai. But it is priced primarily against models in the smaller of those two classes, which is a good start. We'll give you a bit more detail on that. Now, the cheapest mid-sized crossover SUVs, Qashqais, Seat Atticas, Kia Sportages and so on, are priced from just over the £20,000 point. But when they're equipped with the kind of engine and trim that you get with an ASX in base dynamic form, they'd cost you £23,000 or more. So if that's your point of comparison, then there's a saving right there. But as we just said, Mitsubishi has pitched and priced this ASX against smaller crossovers, and even against those, as we'll see, it stacks up pretty well price-wise against the main players in the segment. Whatever size of SUV your comparisons are being made against, remember when making them that because this Mitsubishi's 2-litre 150 HP engine doesn't have the usual turbocharger, its performance can't be directly compared to other crossovers featuring engines with that same 150 HP level of output. For a better, more like-for-like comparison, you'd need to be looking more at a crossover with a turbo petrol unit developing an output somewhere in the 100 to 115 PS bracket. Check out small SUV contenders powered in that way, say 1-litre TSI 115 PS versions of the Volkswagen T-Cross, the Skoda Kamiq and the Seat Arona, and you'll find them all priced similarly to an entry-level ASX dynamic model pitched at or around the £20,000 mark. But with the VW, the Skoda or the Seat, you'll get less equipment and a car that's fractionally smaller. As for the two sales leaders in the small SUV class, Nissan's Juke and Renault's Captur, well, you'll need mid-range trim and the TCE 100 engine with either of those cars to match the kind of sales proposition offered by a base spec ASX with dynamic trim. And in that case, you'd only be saving a few £100, and in the case of the Nissan and the Renault, you get yourself a slightly smaller car. The same really applies to many of the other small volume branded SUV contenders in this category. Cars like Peugeot's 2008, Vauxhall's Crossland X, Citroen's C3 Aircross, Fiat's 500X, the Ford EcoSport, the Kia Stonic and the Hyundai Kona. i.e. with those models against an ASX, you'd pay something much the same as Mitsubishi is asking here, but you get slightly less kit and slightly less space. You could save a bit by going for a Suzuki Vitara, and even more by choosing, say, a Dacia Duster, an MG ZS or a SsangYong Tivoli, but with those last three rivals, you do tend to get, in terms of build quality, what you don't pay for. Looking to the other end of the compact crossover segment, we can't really see the ASX appealing to someone who would want something more overtly fashion-led in this class, say a Ford Puma, a Kia Exceed or a Toyota CHR. But against those kinds of cars, this boxier ASX has an even greater advantage in terms of price, equipment and interior space. So how much of a really showy pavement statement do you really need to make choosing a car like this? Well, only you can decide. If, quite understandably, you have no real interest in looking at yourself in shop windows as you pass, then you'll be more interested in small crossovers, which we think are more natural competitors to this Mitsubishi. Cars in this category with a more practical perspective that, like this ASX, have been sized to straddle the gap between the small and the mid-sized SUV segments. So here we're thinking of models like Suzuki's S-Cross, which costs a little less than this ASX, and cars like Jeep's Renegade and Honda's HR-V, which cost a bit more. Now, if you are shopping at or around the £20,000 price point for a small SUV like an ASX with dynamic spec, then you might also want to factor in entry-level versions of budget brand mid-sized models that you could get for that kind of spend. Cars like the MG HS and the SsangYong Corando. All our comparative comments so far have been based around the entry-level dynamic version of this ASX as a benchmark. Opt for this pricier, plusher Exceed trim level, and of course the competition gets tougher, especially if you stretch into the top Exceed four-wheel drive CVT variant that we're testing here today. We could see why you might be attracted to this top 4x4 version though. After all, most small SUVs don't offer four-wheel drive as an option at all these days. It is a slightly more common thing to find in the mid-sized SUV segment, but there you'll mostly have to budget from around £30,000 upwards to get four-wheel traction, and probably much more than that if you want the kind of standard spec that you'll get in an ASX Exceed. Enough. Let's say you've considered all that and then concluded that it is an ASX that you really want. Now, then you're going to need to know just how generous Mitsubishi has been when it comes to the standard specification. So let's see. Now, the standard price gets you 18-inch alloy wheels, keyless entry, auto headlamps and wipers, and LED headlamps with LED daytime running lights and auto leveling, plus privacy glass, chromed exhaust trim and rear spoiler. Inside, in a dynamic spec ASX, you'll find the reversing camera, heated front seats, automatic air conditioning and an auto dimming rear view mirror. With competitors, you'll usually have to stretch high up into the trim hierarchy to get features like those. Plus, of course, every ASX covers off all the basics that you'll want these days from a car like this. Stuff like cruise control, a leather steering wheel and gear knob, a Thatcham Category 1 alarm, and a really decent standard of safety and infotainment. In this case, in terms of media kit, that will mean an 8-inch SDA smartphone link display audio setup with Bluetooth, a 6-speaker DAB audio system, steering wheel controls, and Apple CarPlay, Android Auto smartphone mirroring. Want more? Then you'll want this Exceed level of trim, and that's recognisable from the outside by black roof rails, chromed exterior door handles and a panoramic glass roof. Inside, in an Exceed spec ASX, you'll get leather upholstery, a powered driver's seat, a TomTom satellite navigation system and some extra camera-driven safety features, and we'll come on to those in a few moments. What about options? Well, before we get into that, bear in mind that you'll almost certainly be paying your Mitsubishi dealer more for your choice of paint colour. This solid frost white shade is the only one that comes as standard. Beyond that, there are various metallic, pearlescent and diamond style paint finishes that your salesperson will want you to consider. You might want to embellish this with front and rear undergarnish fittings, and you can have a Carmen style front grille if you want to reduce the amount of chromed bling at the front here. Tailgate garnishes are also available in either brushed alloy or chrome. You can also add in various kinds of door entry tread plates, some of those illuminated. As for practical touches, well, the obvious one is a tow bar. There are either fixed or detachable options. If you've got that, there's a further option to add a bike carrier that can carry a couple of cycles in behind the tailgate. You can add mudguards at the front and the back. A boot tray can be fitted to protect the cargo area floor, and a range of child seats are available too. On to safety. Now, there's no point in adding in sophisticated safety features to a car that isn't fundamentally created from the outset with crash protection in mind. Now, fortunately, this ASX has been, thanks to the use of Mitsubishi's RISE, or Reinforced Impact Safety Evolution safety body design. Now, this involves the use of an extremely strong monocoque structure made from ultra-high tensile steel to ensure maximum crash protection from all angles while directing impact forces away from occupants and the car's extremities. So that's a good starting point. Unfortunately though, because of the age of this car's basic design, Mitsubishi hasn't been able to add in the kind of autonomous braking system that most of its competitors do use. The kind of thing that you would find in the next model up in the brand's SUV range, the more modern Eclipse Cross model. In fact, the base dynamic spec version of this car doesn't get any kind of camera style safety kit at all, which does seem rather backwards in this day and age. At least the Japanese maker hasn't forgotten to include a driver's knee airbag. That is a feature that is missing on many competitors in this segment, alongside the usual twin front, side and curtain airbags. As you would expect, there are also all the usual electronic systems here for traction, stability and braking, plus a tyre pressure monitoring system, rear ISOFIX child seat fastenings and hill start assist to stop you from drifting backwards on uphill junctions. If you want more in terms of safety, your dealer would be keen to mention that with top XC spec, you can do a bit better. Now for this level of trim, Mitsubishi was able to add in a couple of camera features that didn't require a complete structural redesign for incorporation. So there's lane change assist, which warns you if you're drifting out of your lane and will apply subtle steering lock to ease you back to where you should be. Plus there is a blind spot warning system, and that will alert you if you're just about to dangerously pull out to overtake in the path of another vehicle. There's also rear cross traffic alert. Now that, when you're reversing out of a space, warns you about oncoming traffic. The match of a big, normally aspirated power plant with old school SUV design isn't one likely to produce an especially class competitive set of fuel and CO2 readings, and that is pretty much how it turns out here. Actually, this ASX is dirtier in terms of emissions than Mitsubishi's larger Eclipse Cross SUV, which isn't that surprising given that this smaller model has a larger engine capacity and a very comparable curb weight figure. A manual version of this ASX manages 37.7 mpg on the WLTP combined cycle and 161 grams per kilometre of NEDC rated CO2. To give you some class perspective, in the segment for small SUVs, the sector average from cars of the T-Cross and Capture genre tends to be around 50 mpg and around 115 grams per kilometre. But then, as we've said elsewhere in this film, a typical buyer of this Mitsubishi probably won't be especially interested in compact crossovers of that kind. The more practically orientated SUVs are the more closely matched to this Mitsubishi at this price point. Cars like MG's HS and the Ssangyong Corando produce efficiency figures that are very much in line with those of this ASX. So, as ever with a car like this, it depends on what you want. If that's an automatic gearbox with four-wheel drive, then the version of the ASX that provides both those things, the version we're trying here, manages 34.4 mpg and 167 grams per kilometre. Ultimately, of course, we can talk about figures all day, but the ultimate cleanliness and frugality of any car has as much to do with the driver as with the automotive engineer. Now, there aren't many tools provided here to help you with that. This ASX doesn't have the green driving score system that you get on the centre dash infotainment screen in an Eclipse Cross. Instead, you're limited to a little fuel consumption meter which shows on the small display between the instrument dials here. What else? Well, insurance ratings are quite a bit higher than the class average. This top Exceed four-wheel drive auto model actually has the lowest rating, Group 23E. For the Exceed manual, it's Group 25E. For the base dynamic spec manual variant, it's Group 24E. Residual value predictions are reasonable though. Industry experts reckon that after 3 years and 36,000 miles, dynamic spec ASX will still be worth 39.4% of its original value. For this Exceed four-wheel drive auto version, that figure would fall marginally to 38.3%, while for the Exceed two-wheel drive derivative, it'd be 37.9%. Another thing that you might be encouraged by as a potential buyer is a decently long 5-year warranty, although that is slightly spoiled by the brand's insistence on limiting it to 62,500 miles. As you'd expect in this day and age, there's a 12-year anti-perforation warranty, and 3 years of pan-European roadside assistance and home start are included in the price. Servicing is required every year or 12,500 miles, whichever comes around first, and you can keep maintenance costs down by purchasing a decent value prepaid servicing pack, which takes care of the cost of garage visits for 3 years or 36,000 miles. The pack costs £450, and Mitsubishi says that over 90% of its customers purchase that. If you've read any of the magazine reports on this car, then you might have gathered that the motoring press isn't exactly enamoured with it. Our perspective, though, is slightly different. Not everyone buying a compact crossover cares about sharp handling, sophisticated cabin architecture, and cutting-edge efficiency. What if you simply don't want to pay over the odds for a car of this kind, and you just need it to be good-looking, supremely well-equipped, metronomically reliable, decently spacious, and actually to be able to do a bit more than pretend to be an SUV? Well, if that's your perspective, then there is just a chance that you might actually quite like what Mitsubishi has tried to do here. Judging it by the standards of the latest models in this segment is a bit pointless because the basic design of this car is over a decade old. On that basis, you could well argue that Mitsubishi has done rather well to keep it as competitive as it is. But the test of time has told here. Even if you don't care about the fact that this ASX doesn't enjoy being thrown about, you'd miss the way that in just about any other rival, a turbocharged engine makes life so much easier in terms of mid-range pulling power. This Mitsubishi's normally aspirated unit is, like the rest of the car, from a different era. But that was an era in which cars of this kind had some sort of off-road capability. They could tow properly, and in 4x4 form, they could tackle the odd forest trail without damage. Now, this ASX is no off-roader, but in this top form at least, it can manage both those things better than nearly all its competitors. Even the front-driven version, if equipped with a set of winter tyres, would leave you feeling a bit more confident in a snowy snap about the aggravation of a trip to Asda. In summary then, what we've got here is a modern take on old school values. One day soon, Mitsubishi will find itself beyond the need to offer such a thing. But what it does, we can see a small but loyal market for this car, just as it is.